What's up, Doc Mike? Public Health on Call. By Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Today's topic for October 7, 2020. COVID-19 vaccine questions. Thank you, Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health.
Welcome to Season 2 of Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I'm Joshua Sharfstein, Vice Dean for Public Health Practice and Community Engagement, and a former secretary of Maryland's Health Department. Our goal is to bring scientific evidence and experience to the public health news of the day through informative interviews with scientists, community leaders, policy experts, public health officials, clinicians, and more. If you have ideas or questions for us to cover, please email us at publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Today, I speak to Dr. Ruth Karen, a professor of international health at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Dr. Karen is also one of the top vaccine experts in the world. In recent years, she has served on key vaccine committees for the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and for the World Health Organization. She has also chaired the Major Vaccine Advisory Committee to the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. In our conversation, she answers a long list of important questions about COVID vaccines. Let's listen. Dr. Karen, thank you so much for joining me. It would be great if you could introduce yourself to our listeners, starting maybe with how long you've been working as a vaccine scientist.
Yeah, so I've been working on vaccines for probably about 2.5 decades. I'm a pediatrician and also trained in infectious diseases and virology, and I lead the Center for Immunization Research and the Johns Hopkins Vaccine Initiative here at the Bloomberg School.
And what vaccines have you worked on in your career?
So I've done a fair amount of work on influenza vaccines, and I've also worked recently quite a bit on vaccines for respiratory syncytial virus, or RSV, which is the leading cause of pneumonia in infants and young children globally.
So given your experience and your expertise in respiratory viruses and vaccines, I'm sure you've been very closely following the development of a vaccine for COVID-19. And so I'm going to start with a big question, which is, how close are we to a vaccine?
Well, I think there are some very encouraging developments. As I think probably many people listening know, we have a few vaccines now that will go into phase 3 trials, which are also known as efficacy trials. So that means that those vaccines have passed certain goalposts, if you will, in terms of initial evaluations of safety and immune response, such that they can be evaluated in larger trials. So we know that these vaccines are promising, but we don't yet know if they're going to work. And that's what the purpose of an efficacy trial is, as well as a broader assessment of safety of the vaccine in a large number of people.
So tell me more about these efficacy trials. What do they actually entail?
So first of all, they involve large numbers of people. In these particular efficacy trials for these COVID vaccines, there are going to be about 30,000 people enrolled per trial. And individuals are given vaccine, and then they're followed both to make sure that the side effects from the vaccine are acceptable, but also to see whether they develop COVID. Whether they develop a SARS-CoV-2 infection along with some symptoms. And then the rates, these are placebo-controlled trials, meaning that some individuals will get vaccine and some individuals will get placebo. And then the rates of disease will be compared in the people who got placebo and the people who got vaccine to determine the efficacy of the vaccine.
So how successful does a vaccine have to be in one of these studies to be considered effective?
So recently, the FDA issued guidance about the development of COVID vaccines. And the guidance that they issued to vaccine manufacturers, and of course, this is a document that's available to the general public, is that a vaccine would need to be at least 50% effective, meaning that an individual who is vaccinated would be 50% less likely to get COVID disease, whatever the particular endpoint is that's measured in the trial, than individuals who weren't vaccinated. And I think this is a reasonable goal for a couple of reasons. One reason is that typically the more severe a disease is, the better chance a vaccine has of preventing that disease. So a vaccine that's 50% effective against mild COVID disease, which might be the endpoint that's measured in a clinical trial, or let's say any COVID disease, any evidence of infection with any symptom, which is how a lot of these trials are designed, might be even more effective against severe disease. The other reason that I think this is a reasonable goal is when you have a disease that's as prevalent as COVID. If we think about what the United States, for example, has experienced in the past several months in terms of severe disease and death, even if we were only able to cut those numbers in half, that would be a major achievement.
Now, how long would you think a vaccine be effective for? So I can understand if you get 50% effectiveness or more, that's good news. But if it's only for a few months, then that's not such good news. How long do you think a vaccine would need to be effective for? And, what are your expectations on the duration of immunity?
Well, I think time will tell for that. I think the short answer to that is we don't yet know. Even the data that we have on the vaccine so far in smaller studies, we haven't yet had the opportunity to follow individuals for very long, because as you think about it, the very first people who got the very first vaccine were immunized in March. And so, it's only July. So we don't know very much about the durability of the immune response in people. I think our hope would be that it would be at least a year or more, and then maybe people might need boosters. It's also possible that a vaccine might not entirely protect against mild disease. So you might actually experience mild disease and then have a boost in your immune response, but not suffer severe disease. And I think from a public health perspective, that's really completely acceptable. If we turn to severe disease, not into no disease, but even into mild disease, I think that would be a real victory.
Got it. Now, let's talk about safety. What are they looking for in a 30,000 person study to figure out whether a vaccine is considered safe enough to use?
Well, every person who's enrolled in the trial will complete information about the kinds of acute symptoms that you might expect following an injection, following a shot. So people will obviously need to provide information about swelling and redness and tenderness and around the site, and then fever and any other symptoms that they might experience in the short, let's say in the 3 to 7 days following vaccination. More long-term, I think people will also be looking to make sure that when COVID disease is experienced, there's not any evidence of more severe disease with vaccination. There was a lot of discussion as these vaccines were being developed of a concern about disease enhancement. And this is based on some animal models, not with COVID, not with SARS-CoV-2, but with other coronaviruses. We haven't seen any evidence of enhanced disease thus far, and I think there are a number of scientific reasons why we don't think it should occur with these vaccines. But of course, it's something that we would watch for very carefully, just as we watch for any other safety signal.
So how should we think about the possibility for adverse effects that might come up after the period of the vaccine trial?
So a couple of things to mention about that. One is that individuals who are enrolled in these trials will be followed for at least a year or longer. And in fact, it may be that a vaccine is either approved for emergency use or licensed before all of that long-term follow-up is completed. But nevertheless, companies will be obligated to complete that follow-up and to report the results of that follow-up back to the FDA. In addition, it's very likely, and this happens would not just happen with COVID vaccines, but happens whenever the FDA licenses vaccines, is there's often an obligation for post-licensure assessments. And I'm sure that if a COVID vaccine is licensed, the companies will work with the FDA to determine exactly what kind of post-licensure safety assessments will need to be done.
So in a sense, a vaccine approval is based on the information that's there now, recognizing a substantial benefit in reducing the spread of a potentially lethal disease, and that acknowledges that there may be some safety questions that come up later, but those will be tracked carefully.
Exactly. Yes.
So let me ask you, what we've talked about so far, those are pretty general principles for vaccine studies, would you say?
Yes, I agree.
And so when we're thinking about the coronavirus vaccine, we know that it affects certain populations more than others, particularly older adults and people with chronic illnesses. What would you like to see in these studies to address the question of whether a vaccine will be protective for them?
So, first of all, I think it's important to enroll older adults in these studies. And all of these large efficacy trials that I mentioned earlier will be stratified such that there are some younger adults and some older adults that are enrolled. I also think it will be important to enroll older adults across an age span, across a spectrum, because a 65-year-old is not the same as an 85-year-old. Also, a healthy older adult is not the same as a frail older adult who might be living in a care facility. So I think we'll need some information about diverse elderly populations in order to think about how to allocate vaccine. And just to mention that there may also be other alternatives for older adults if they don't respond well to vaccines. There's a lot of work going on development of monoclonal antibodies, and those could be an alternative for groups that don't respond well to vaccines, such as elderly, frail adults.
So let's say there are 30,000 patients in the study. There may be only a few hundred or that are, say, really old, maybe over 80, over 85, something like that. What can you learn from a relatively small population of much older adults that would be informative for that group of people? So
you're right that we may not have a large enough number of people in that substratum, so in that smaller group, to directly look at efficacy of a vaccine, but we might have enough certainly to look at the immune response, for example, to look at the antibody response to the vaccine. If in the course of these efficacy trials, we can determine a correlative protection, that is, for example, a laboratory measure, most likely a level of antibody, of a particular kind of antibody, that correlates with protection against COVID disease, then at least what we can do is look at those same immune responses in that subset of very elderly and say, are they the same or are they different than the younger groups? And if they are the same, then we may be more comfortable in making the leap to say, gee, it's likely that those individuals are also going to be protected by the vaccine.
So in a sense, we're going to learn more from a vaccine trial than just whether the vaccine works. We're going to find out perhaps what predicts whether the vaccine works. And that way, we might be able to use that information to understand, without having to do a whole new trial, who might be protected by a vaccine.
That's right. It's certainly a hope. There are many, many, many vaccines. In fact, I would say the majority of vaccines that we use today don't have such a marker of protection. And they're very effective. And just because we can't detect a marker doesn't mean that a vaccine is not effective. It means that we're not smart enough to figure out what that marker should be. But certainly for all of the reasons that you said, we really hope that there will be such a marker of protection, because then we can link that, and in FDA speak, that's called bridging. We can bridge to another population where we can, rather than doing a whole efficacy trial, we can just look at that marker of immunity.
Dr. Karen, how should we think about the need for racial and ethnic diversity in these clinical trials for a vaccine?
It's critically important that we have racial and ethnic diversity. We know that COVID is particularly severe, causes increased rates of severe disease in Latinx populations, in Black populations, and in American Indian populations. And we will certainly want to be able to offer COVID vaccines to these high-risk populations and encourage their use. But we need to know how well these vaccines work in these populations, and if, for example, different vaccines work differently, so that we can offer the most effective vaccines.
Now, it would certainly not be an understatement to say that there can be a measure of distrust between some people from communities that have experienced a fair amount of discrimination from the healthcare system. How does that play into vaccine research?
So it's really important to engage those communities and to do it in a number of ways. One way is to engage local leaders early in the process, and a lot of that work is going on. Lay leaders, leaders of faith communities in the process, to have focus groups to find out from potential volunteers what are their concerns and how can those concerns be allayed. And I think also a very important issue that has been raised by some people who might potentially volunteer for some of these trials has to do with eventual access. So people want to have some sense that if they participate in a trial, not only might they have access to vaccine at the end of the trial, but their families would, their communities would. So ensuring access among these high-risk communities and vulnerable communities is really critical.
So in a sense, a clear policy decision to make sure that vaccine is widely available without charge might actually help with the studies to prove whether or not the vaccines are safe and effective.
Yes, I think that's absolutely the case. I think that I completely agree. And that is a concern that people have raised. And I think it's great that you brought up the without charge piece of it too, because a vaccine that's made available but costs something to the individual may not be used, particularly for people who don't have health insurance, for people who are undocumented. It really has to be broadly and freely available.
Got it. Well, I want to talk about maybe some other specific populations. One that comes to mind is pregnant women. And we certainly know that pregnant women can get COVID-19, and there are some signs that they may have a more severe course. How do you think about the issue of pregnant women in vaccine studies?
So a few things to say about this, and I will just say that I've done some work in this area along particularly with a number of colleagues, but most particularly with Ruth Faden and Carly Krubner in the Berman Institute of Bioethics, specifically related to ensuring that pregnant women are considered and included in vaccine development and implementation for vaccines against epidemic and pandemic diseases. So, of course, COVID fits absolutely into some of the paradigms that we developed. A couple of principles just to say is that when thinking about trials, there needs to be a justification for excluding pregnant women from trials rather than a justification for including them. And the justification often is, and certainly is in the case of these early stage vaccines, that we don't know enough yet about the vaccine or the vaccine platform or the safety of the vaccine to do a study in pregnant people, pregnant women. So, as an example, the mRNA vaccine, we don't have a licensed mRNA vaccine. It's a new platform, and we're just learning about the safety of that platform, and it wouldn't have been appropriate to include pregnant women in the early stage trials.
That's the vaccine from Moderna, is that right?
Exactly,
Mm-hmm.
exactly. And from the one that is advancing into efficacy trials, there's one from Moderna. There's also one made by Pfizer.
I see.
And actually a number of other companies are also making mRNA vaccines.
I see. So since that's an entirely new type of vaccine, you wouldn't have pregnant women as the first people in the study.
Exactly. But one thing that's really important to think about is, as I mentioned, these are going to be really big efficacy studies, these 30,000 person studies. And they're certainly going to enroll women of childbearing potential. And even though what we call an exclusion criterion, women are not supposed to be pregnant at the time they are enrolled, and usually women of childbearing potential will take a pregnancy test prior to enrollment and immunization. But even so, we know from previous experience that it's quite likely that some women will become pregnant in a month or 2 or 3 after immunization. It happens quite frequently. And so one thing that we do think is important is for companies and the government to anticipate that this will be the case and to think about how they will systematically collect data from women who do become pregnant during these trials. The data need to be interpreted cautiously because pregnant women aren't being formally randomized, and we don't have that kind of trial design. But yet, I think there are important things that could be learned, and it's important to think now about how to collect those data. And then down the road, it's also important to think about how pregnant women could be directly included in both in trials and ultimately in deployment of vaccines.
So for pregnant women, it's very much a one step at a time.
Yes.
What about for young children who, as we know, are much less likely to get severe disease? Would your approach to clinical trials be different for them than for older adults, say?
Yes, I think we need to learn about a bit more about the epidemiology in children. Certainly, fortunately, children do not seem to suffer from acute COVID disease at the rates that adults do. Very fortunate thing. I think we need to learn more about that. And I think we also need to learn from our trials in adults before we make decisions about how and whether children will be included in vaccine trials.
Got it. Now, once we have a vaccine, we made it through these various stages and we're ready to start immunizing people outside of a pure clinical trial. How far along the spectrum are we to really getting the benefit of a vaccine? How much of all the work of vaccination is developing the vaccine compared to what comes next?
Well, it would be hard for me to give you a percentage, but best vaccine in the world won't work if it isn't used. And use has really 2 parts to it. One is availability and access. And the other part, of course, is acceptance. And so we need to think about what kind of an infrastructure we should be planning now for what we're going to need to put in place in order to be able to deliver this vaccine, certainly to all adults at a minimum over time. And we'll set priorities. Not everybody is going to get vaccine all at once, but certainly over time, we will expect that all adults will receive vaccine, and perhaps children. So we need to have systems in place that can deliver vaccine. And at the same time, we need to make sure that vaccine is acceptable. We need to communicate the importance of vaccination to the public and address their concerns so that we can not only be able to deliver vaccine, but have vaccine be accepted by the public.
So there's a lot of work still to be done, but viewed another way, this isn't science fiction. We're really on a path to a vaccine for a brand new infectious disease.
Yes, I completely agree, Josh. I mean, if you think back to the fact that in January, we barely knew what this virus was. And here we are 7 months later, embarking on efficacy trials. It's really a remarkable accomplishment. We have a lot to do yet, as we've talked about, and in the time that we're doing these things, that we're assessing the efficacy of vaccines and making sure that they can be delivered to the public, people really need to stay safe and to do all of the things that we've been encouraging them to do all along. But I think we are well on our way to developing vaccines, not only for people in the United States, but my hope is for people all over the world.
Well, that's fantastic. And thank you so much, Dr. Karen, for spending so much time with me today.
Really my pleasure.
Public Health on Call is produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, Stephanie Desmond, and Lamari Morales. Audio production by Spencer Greer, Niall Owen McCusker, Cian Oates, and Matthew Martin, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Thank you for listening.